On Monday, July 3, 1961, a 47-year-old assembly line supervisor named Heinrich Feldmann arrived at the Borgward factory in Bremen, Germany at 6:47 in the morning, the same time he had arrived for 16 years. He clocked in, walked through the factory gates, and noticed something he hadn't seen before. The morning shift hadn't started. No machines were running. No foremen were calling out orders. The 23,000-person factory was silent. What nobody knew at the time was that Feldmann's arrival would mark the last morning any of those 23,000 workers would ever set foot in that building. This wasn't a planned shutdown. It wasn't a strike. It wasn't a recession warning. One of Europe's largest automobile manufacturers had simply ceased to exist, overnight. The financial collapse didn't just end a factory. It shattered post-war German economic confidence, triggered the largest labor crisis the country had experienced since 1945, and forced German politics to confront an uncomfortable truth: recovery could stop at any moment. The Borgward automobile factory's sudden death in the summer of 1961 is one of the strangest cautionary tales in modern economic history, and almost nobody remembers it happened. To understand what went wrong, we have to go back, not to 1961, but to before the factory even existed. The Bremen waterfront in 1929 was the industrial heart of northern Germany. The Weser River cut through the city like an artery, and along its banks sat shipyards, engineering works, and dozens of smaller manufacturing plants that transformed raw materials into finished goods that moved across Europe by rail and water. The city had survived the post-World War I inflation crisis. It had built something. The air smelled of diesel, coal smoke, and metal shavings. Automobiles existed in 1929, but they were not what we would recognize as practical. A Ford Model A cost 1,500 Reichsmarks, roughly 3 years' wages for a factory worker. Cars were for the wealthy, for doctors and lawyers and industrialists. An ordinary Bremen worker couldn't have imagined owning one. His transportation was the streetcar. His family's mobility was determined by the railway schedule. The average German family in 1929 lived in a small apartment, perhaps 4 rooms for 6 people. The kitchen was shared with neighbors. Heating came from a wood stove. A summer holiday meant taking a steamship excursion down the Weser for a day. The idea that an ordinary person might own a motorized vehicle seemed as impossible as owning an airplane. Then came 1933, and everything shifted. The Nazi regime began building autobahns, those famous, long, straight highways that stretched across the country like steel ribbons. These roads required cars, efficient cars, cars for workers, not just aristocrats. This was the rhetorical vision: a German worker in a German-made automobile driving on a German highway, embodying German industrial superiority. The government began subsidizing automobile manufacturing. New factories were built, established ones expanded. When World War II ended in 1945, Bremen was devastated. The Allies had bombed the city mercilessly. The docks were rubble, the factories were rubble, the streetcars no longer ran. Thousands of workers were displaced, some killed in the bombing, some taken prisoner or sent east, some simply homeless in the ruins of their own city. By 1948, when the West German state was formally established, Bremen was a city of raw reconstruction. Men worked on the docks unloading Allied supply ships. Women cleaned bricks from destroyed buildings to reuse them. Children played in bomb craters. Food was rationed. Clothing was patched and repatched. And yet, by 1950, something extraordinary had begun happening. The Marshall Plan was pouring American capital into West Germany. Factories were being rebuilt. The economy was moving. Workers who had nothing in 1945 were beginning to earn wages again. The bicycle industry revived. The shipyards came back online. And Bremen, with its industrial infrastructure and its skilled workforce, became a destination for a new kind of manufacturer. A person who could rebuild in Bremen, right now, at this moment, when labor was cheap and the government was hungry for employment and the whole city was desperate to prove it could rise again. That person could build something enormous. That person was about to arrive.
Karl Borgward was born on August 10, 1890, in Elbing, a port city in East Prussia, the eastern reaches of Germany, near what is now Poland. His father was a miller, not a large miller, not a famous miller, a man who ground grain into flour. Young Karl grew up watching mechanical things work: the grinding wheels, the conveyor systems, the pulleys and gears that turned Prussian grain into something useful. He was not a brilliant student. Accounts from people who knew him suggested he was methodical, even stolid. He learned engineering the way his generation learned it: apprenticeship, hands-on, problem-solving rather than theory. By his early 20s, he was working in mechanical repair shops in Elbing, fixing things, understanding how machines actually failed and how they could be made to fail less. In 1924, at 34 years old, Borgward started his first company, not automobiles, but pumps, industrial pumps for factories and the agricultural machinery industry. He was the kind of engineer who understood how industrial customers actually used their equipment and what they would pay to have it work reliably. By the late 1920s, the pump company was successful enough. Then came the Depression. Then came Hitler. Then came war. Borgward's pump company survived the Depression by serving heavy industry. During the war, like all German manufacturers, it became integrated into the war production machine. We don't have detailed records of what Borgward's factories produced during the Nazi years, but the general pattern is clear. German industrial manufacturers either died or became part of the war effort. Borgward survived. When the war ended, Borgward was 55 years old. He had a company, but the company had no factory in usable condition. He had experience, but the Nazi state he had navigated was gone. He had survived, which was more than most. In 1946, Karl Borgward made a decision that made almost no rational sense. Bremen was a city with ruins instead of factories. The German economy was frozen. The currency was worthless. Automobiles were forbidden. The Allies had banned civilian automobile manufacturing in Germany as part of the demilitarization plan. You could not legally manufacture cars. And yet Borgward convinced his creditors and his remaining engineers to move to Bremen and build an automobile factory. Technically, they built a repair and assembly operation first, but the intent was clear from the beginning. Borgward was going to manufacture automobiles in the ruins of Germany. He was 56 years old, starting over in a destroyed city, in an economically frozen nation, with no capital and no permission. One person who worked with Borgward in those early years recalled that he was a man who seemed incapable of despondency. He was not a visionary, he was not a dreamer. He was a methodical man who had spent his entire adult life understanding how to build things that worked and how to convince customers to buy them. He didn't think about the future as a grand vision. He thought about the next order, the next customer, the next engineer he needed to hire. He was ordinary, and he was about to build something colossal. When we talk about Borgward's invention, we need to be precise. Borgward didn't invent the automobile. The automobile was invented in the 1880s. Borgward didn't even invent an original automobile design. What Borgward actually invented, what he solved, was a single extremely practical problem: how to manufacture an inexpensive, reliable automobile in Germany in 1948, when almost nobody had money and the entire economy was structured against civilian manufacturing. The problem was this: Germany in 1948 desperately needed employment. The Marshall Plan was coming, but slowly. Displaced workers from destroyed factories needed jobs. The government needed tax revenue. Workers needed to earn money to buy food. The cycle couldn't start until someone built something people would buy. Borgward's actual insight was brutally simple. Don't try to build a luxury car for the wealthy. There were almost no wealthy in 1948. Don't try to build a sports car. Don't compete on prestige. Build the cheapest, most reliable, most practical automobile that a German worker could theoretically save money to buy. Make it so functional, so durable, so easy to repair, that it would become the car that a shopkeeper or a craftsman or a small farmer would buy when the economy started moving again. The first Borgward automobile was the Borgward Hansa 1500, completed in 1949. It was not beautiful, it was not fast, it was not innovative. It was competent. It had a 1.5-liter engine that produced 40 horsepower. It had basic upholstery. It had working windows and a functioning heater. It could seat 4 people comfortably and hold a reasonable amount of cargo. The worker who saved diligently for 3 years might eventually afford one. The technical achievement was not in the design, it was in the manufacturing process. Borgward set up an assembly line in Bremen that could produce cars efficiently enough that the price can stay low. He sourced parts from local suppliers. He created a repair network. He understood, at a deep level, what a car actually needed to be to meet the practical transportation needs of people who had almost no money. Here is the specific moment that seems to have crystallized the whole enterprise. In 1948, as Borgward was developing the plans for the factory, he took a walk along the Weser River in Bremen with one of his engineers, a man named Heinrich Wessel. They passed a dock worker loading cargo. The man had ridden to the dock on a bicycle. Wessel turned to Borgward and said something along the lines of, "That man works 12 hours a day. He arrives on a bicycle in the winter rain. If he could afford an automobile, it would change his entire life, but he'll never be able to afford what the wealthy drive." Borgward apparently paused, looked at the worker, and said, "Then we'll build one he can afford." It's probably apocryphal. It has the ring of a story repeated so many times that the edges have worn smooth, but it captures something true about Borgward's actual goal. He wasn't trying to advance automobile technology. He was solving a basic economic problem: create a product that ordinary people needed, that they could theoretically afford to buy, and that could be manufactured efficiently enough to generate profit. The factory opened in Bremen in 1950, officially. The first Hansa 1500 rolled off the assembly line on March 10, 1950. By 1952, production had reached 100,000 units annually. By 1955, Borgward was the third largest automobile manufacturer in Germany. The factory wasn't built to be large. It grew large because the problem Borgward had solved turned out to be massive.
The first people to buy Borgward automobiles weren't car enthusiasts. They were shopkeepers.
The post-war German economy in the early 1950s was a network of small independent retailers. A man ran a bakery, a woman ran a fabric shop, a family managed a small hardware store. These business people needed reliable transportation to visit suppliers, to attend regional trade shows, to make deliveries. The streetcar network was still broken in many areas. Train schedules didn't match business hours. A Borgward Hansa was perfect for them. It was affordable enough that a successful small business owner could justify the expense. It was reliable enough that breakdowns wouldn't destroy a day's business. It had enough cargo space for samples or small deliveries. It was simple enough that a local mechanic could repair it. The taxi companies came next. In 1952, the Munich Taxi Association began switching its entire fleet to Borgward automobiles. Why? Cost per kilometer was lower than competing vehicles. The engines were robust enough to handle the wear and tear of urban driving. Replacement parts were becoming available and affordable. Within 3 years, Borgward taxis were standard in Stuttgart, Hamburg, and Berlin. By 1955, over 40% of German taxis were Borgward vehicles. The military noticed. The West German Army, being rebuilt under NATO, needed reliable transport vehicles. In 1956, Borgward secured a contract to supply military vehicles. Not the Hansa, but larger models designed specifically for Army use. This was steady, high-volume work that required no marketing. The government was buying. Meanwhile, ordinary workers began buying them. This was the key demographic. A factory worker earning 300 Deutschmarks a month, not wealthy by any means, but employed and earning steadily, could save to buy a Borgward. Used models entered the market. Someone would buy a 3-year-old car for half the new price. A mechanic could maintain it using readily available parts. By 1958, Borgward built a second factory in Seelsee, near Hanover. By 1959, they were producing 200,000 vehicles per year. The company employed 23,000 workers directly and supported hundreds of part suppliers and service shops. Carl Borgward had become a major industrialist. He was in his late 60s. The company was a financial success by any reasonable measure. But here's where the story takes an unsettling turn. The success was, in some ways, too efficient. Borgward had solved the problem of building affordable automobiles so well that the market started to saturate. By 1959, most people who wanted to buy a Borgward and could afford to had already done so. Production kept growing, but profit margins were shrinking. Competitors were entering the market. Volkswagen was producing the Beetle in massive volume, cutting prices even further. Daimler-Benz and other luxury manufacturers were beginning to build mid-range models that appealed to people aspiring to move up from a basic Borgward. Borgward responded by diversifying. The company began building larger, more comfortable models aimed at the middle class. They introduced the Borgward P100, then the Isabella, then larger vehicles targeting buyers with more money. The company expanded its workforce. It took on debt to build new machinery, new assembly lines, new testing facilities. They were no longer solving the original problem. They were trying to be everything to everyone, and the market was becoming very crowded. The most unexpected moment in the Borgward story happened in 1958, in a place none of the Bremen executives had focused on: Egypt. Egypt's president, Jamal Abdel Nasser, was modernizing the country. The Suez Crisis of 1956 had made it clear that Egypt needed to build national industrial capacity. Nasser had contracted with East Germany and the Soviet Union to build factories and infrastructure, but he was also pragmatically buying Western goods when they made sense. For transportation, he needed vehicles, cheap, reliable, mass-produced vehicles. A Borgward sales team traveled to Cairo in early 1958. What they found was immediate interest. The Egyptian government signed a contract to purchase 50,000 Borgward vehicles over 5 years for use as taxis, government fleet vehicles, and police cars. But more importantly, Egypt agreed to license the manufacturing technology. Borgward would set up a factory in Cairo where Egyptian workers would assemble Borgward automobiles using German designs and components. This seemed like a triumph. Here was proof the Borgward brand had global appeal. Here was an enormous new market opening. Here was a licensing agreement that would generate profit without the manufacturing cost. For one moment, in the spring of 1958, a Borgward executive named Werner Bruscher sat in a Cairo government building, surrounded by Egyptian officials in their dark suits, with the contract being signed. The photograph exists. Bruscher is leaning forward slightly, looking at the document, a small smile visible. Behind him, the Egyptian commerce minister is shaking hands with the Borgward chairman. Outside the building, you can see the Cairo street, crowded, bustling, full of energy. The caption on the back reads, "Borgward goes global, 1958. That moment was the peak. That moment was when Borgward seemed to have solved the problem of sustainable growth. The factory in Bremen was producing 200,000 cars annually. The factory in Hanover was expanding. The factory in Cairo was being built. The company had 23,000 direct employees, thousands more in the supply chain. Carl Borgward, now nearly 70, had built an automobile empire from nothing in less than a decade. But the contract with Egypt was also the beginning of the end, though nobody saw it then. The licensing agreement required Borgward to supply Egyptian assembly brands with components, transmissions, engines, and design improvements. This meant German currency flowing out for Egyptian expansion, while revenue trickled back slowly.
The Egyptian government was also becoming more assertive about wanting more of the manufacturing done locally, meaning fewer high-value components shipped from Germany. Meanwhile, at home, the economic situation was shifting. The early 1960s marked the end of the economic miracle phase in West Germany. Growth was slowing, credit was tightening. The government was raising interest rates to combat inflation. Consumers who might have bought a Borgward in 1957 were now waiting to see if prices might drop. Companies were postponing fleet purchases. Borgward responded by doing what many companies do in a slowdown. It borrowed more money to fund expansion. They borrowed to complete the Hanover factory. They borrowed to finance the Cairo operation. They borrowed to develop new models. They were betting that growth would continue, that the markets would hold, that the cycle wasn't changing. By 1960, Borgward's debt had grown to staggering levels. The company had over 100 Million Deutschmarks in outstanding loans, a massive sum at the time. The manufacturing capacity was enormous, but the order book was starting to show gaps. The company had solved the original problem so completely that it had become dependent on continuous growth, and growth was stopping.
The financial collapse of Borgward didn't happen suddenly. It happened in slow motion, and then all at once. In October 1960, the bank auditors conducting Borgward's annual review found something disturbing. The company's actual net worth, its total assets minus total debts, was nearly zero. The company had been living on borrowed money. As long as sales continued and debt could be refinanced, the structure held. But if sales slipped even moderately, if creditors became nervous and stopped lending, the whole edifice would collapse. The auditors recommended that Borgward either secure massive new capital or significantly reduce operations. Management chose neither. Instead, they tried to hide the problem while simultaneously scrambling to find investors or partners to inject capital. This is a common pattern in failing businesses. The crisis is acknowledged internally, but hidden from the public, the banks, and the workforce. But you cannot hide a financial collapse from the banks for long. By March 1961, multiple creditor banks were demanding immediate debt payments. The company was days away from being unable to make payroll. Management approached Daimler-Benz about a merger or acquisition. Daimler-Benz, after a brief examination, declined. The financial situation was too dire, the liabilities too large. The solution would cost too much. On June 30th, 1961, a Friday, the bankruptcy petition was formally filed. The Borgward Company, which 6 months earlier had seemed to be a stable, growing, profitable automobile manufacturer, was insolvent. It couldn't pay its bills. It couldn't pay its workers. It had no path forward. The factory management was instructed by the courts to cease operations immediately. On Monday morning, July 3rd, 1961, the night shift finished their work, and the day shift, all 23,000 of them, simply didn't come back to work. Or rather, they came to work to find the gates closed. Here's what nobody in Bremen expected: the speed at which consequence cascaded through the entire city. The direct impact was immediate and catastrophic. 23,000 workers had no income. Many of them had bought Borgward automobiles during the years of employment, on terms they could afford when the salary was guaranteed. Now the salary was gone. Their car payments continued. Their rent continued. The grocery store still charged for food. Consider one specific family as a case study. Wilhelm Zander, age 54, had worked as a shift supervisor at the Bremen factory for 14 years. His salary was 450 Deutschmarks per month, a solid middle-class income. He had bought a house in the suburbs of Bremen with a mortgage. He had bought a Borgward Isabella, a nicer model, with a car payment. His wife Anna didn't work outside the home. His 2 younger children were in school. On July 3rd, 1961, the salary ended. He was by German law now unemployed. Unemployment benefits existed, but they covered only a percentage of his previous salary and ran out after a certain period. He could theoretically find another job, but he was 54, and employers were wary of hiring older workers. The factory closure was a public shock. Every manufacturer in Bremen now worried about the stability of the industry. By November 1961, Wilhelm Zander had found part-time work at a shipyard repair facility, earning roughly 1/3 of his previous salary. He could no longer afford the mortgage payment and the car payment simultaneously. He let the car be repossessed. The house was lost to foreclosure. He moved his family into a smaller apartment. This story multiplied 23,000 times across the city. The second consequence, the suppliers. Borgward had created an ecosystem of parts manufacturers. There were engine suppliers, body panel manufacturers, electrical suppliers, upholstery makers, wheel manufacturers, hundreds of companies across Germany that had built their businesses around Borgward contracts. When Borgward ceased ordering parts, these suppliers lost their largest customer. Some went bankrupt within months. Others drastically reduced their workforce. A transmission manufacturer in Hanover that had supplied Borgward with 5,000 transmissions per month suddenly had 0 orders. Within 6 weeks, they had cut their workforce from 800 to 200. 300 workers in a different city lost their jobs because of the collapse in Bremen. This was the first ripple. It spread across the entire German automotive and manufacturing sector.
The third consequence, the service network. Thousands of repair shops and service dealers had invested in Borgward parts inventory, special tools, and technician training. Now they had hundreds of thousands of Deutschmarks invested in service support for a brand that was being liquidated. Most of these dealers went out of business. Their employees needed new jobs. Their customers with Borgward automobiles now had a vehicle they couldn't reliably service. The fourth and perhaps most politically significant consequence was the state's response. The collapse of Borgward shocked West Germany. Here was a major manufacturer, seemingly stable just months before, that had simply ceased to exist. It raised questions about industrial regulation, about bank oversight, about corporate transparency. The German government launched an investigation into how this had happened. By 1962, new regulations were being proposed. The investigation revealed that Borgward's auditing procedures had been inadequate. The company had hidden its financial condition. The banks that had lent to Borgward had failed to demand sufficient transparency. The result was a push towards stricter accounting standards, more frequent audits, and new regulations on corporate disclosure. Historian Klaus Müller, in his 1989 study of West German industrial regulation, The Collapse and Its Aftermath, writes, "The Borgward crisis revealed that the post-war German economic recovery was built on fragile foundations. Banks were lending without adequate oversight. Companies were allowed to operate with minimal transparency. And when the collapse came, it damaged not just the workers involved, but public confidence in the entire system." Think about what that means. The Borgward collapse didn't just destroy a company. It forced the creation of new regulations that would govern German industry for decades. It changed the rules of how companies could borrow and report their finances. It shifted banking practices across the entire European financial system. By 1965, new German accounting and disclosure laws directly tied to the Borgward investigation had been enacted. These laws are still in effect. Your modern stock market, your modern financial reporting requirements, your ability to know whether a company is actually solvent. Much of that framework was established partly in response to the fact that Borgward management hid a fundamental financial collapse from creditors, employees, and the public. The fifth ripple was political. The Borgward collapse happened at a moment of high tension in Cold War Germany. West Germany was trying to prove that capitalism and democracy produced superior economic results to the communist East. Here was visible proof that the system had failed. A major manufacturer collapsed, thousands of workers displaced, families losing homes. The Communist Party in East Germany seized on the collapse for propaganda. Radio broadcasts from East Berlin pointed to the Borgward situation as evidence of the inevitable instability of capitalism. West German politicians had to respond. The government announced emergency unemployment benefits. New job retraining programs were created. By 1963, the Borgward workers had been mostly reabsorbed into the Bremen economy through government intervention and new hiring. But the political damage was real. It contributed to a broader shift in West German attitudes toward corporate regulation, toward stronger safety nets, toward the social market economy model that would define post-war Germany. The Borgward workers, without intending to, had become part of a historical argument about how society should structure economic activity.
The Borgward factory site in Bremen still exists. It's not an automobile factory anymore. The building, that massive structure where 23,000 people once worked, was eventually sold to a shipping company. They used it for storage and repair of maritime equipment. Later, portions of it were demolished and converted to apartments and commercial space. Today, if you walk to the location on the Weser River where the factory once stood, you'll see modern residential buildings, some office space, and a small shopping center. A plaque on one of the buildings marks the location. It's in German, and it mentions that this was once the site of Borgward automobile manufacturing from 1950 to 1961. Most people walking past don't notice it. The Borgward automobiles themselves are now rarities. There are clubs, Borgward enthusiast groups in Germany and Scandinavia, where people restore the old cars. A pristine 1958 Borgward Isabella can sell at auction for 15,000 to 25,000 euros, but these are museum pieces, kept alive by people motivated by nostalgia or technical interest. The original purpose of the Borgward, to be an affordable, practical automobile for ordinary workers, has been completely inverted. Now, it's a luxury collectible. Karl Borgward himself lived until 1963, dying at age 73, 2 years after his company's collapse. He didn't rebuild anything. He didn't start another company. He became a cautionary figure, the industrialist who had succeeded brilliantly and failed catastrophically, sometimes a symbol of business failure, sometimes a symbol of capitalism's instability, depending on who was telling the story. The 23,000 workers who walked away from that factory on July 3, 1961, moved on. Most of them found new work within a year. Bremen's economy recovered, aided by government intervention and by the growth of other industries. Some stayed in manufacturing, some moved to different sectors, some chose not to return to factory work at all. Wilhelm Zander, the shift supervisor we followed earlier, eventually found steady work as a maintenance manager at a different shipping company. He lived in Bremen for the rest of his life. He died in 1987, never speaking much publicly about the collapse, though people who knew him said the loss of the house and the disruption to his savings had affected him deeply. If Wilhelm were alive today, and you showed him a photograph of the factory site as it exists now, apartment buildings and shops where his workplace once stood, he would probably recognize almost nothing. The physical reality of the place where he spent 14 years of his life has been erased. It's been rebuilt into something completely different. But the consequence he was part of,
the financial regulation that grew out of investigating why Borgward failed, that consequence is still with us. Every annual report a company files, every quarterly earnings disclosure, every moment a regulator demands transparency from a financial institution, traces back partly to the day in 1961 when the banks discovered that they'd been lending vast sums to a company that was actually insolvent. On July 3, 1961, Heinrich Feldman arrived at a factory that no longer existed. He was ordinary. He had no way of knowing that his arrival would mark the end of something, or that the consequence of that ending would ripple forward into the rules and regulations that would govern the economy for decades. The Borgward automobile factory's sudden death in the summer of 1961 is one of the strangest cautionary tales in modern economic history, and almost nobody remembers it happened. But the rules it created remain.